Welcome back for a new collections video. This time we are going to be looking at little bit I have for the Sega Game Gear, the Master System, and the Genesis. So with that said, let's get started. First up, of the few Game Gear games I have, Putt Putter, basically just a putt-putt golf game. Next up, a racing game, Chase HQ, which is considered one of the better racing games on the Game Gear. Also, World Series Baseball. As like here in America, baseball is actually quite popular in Japan. Also, Junction, which is actually a pretty cool, I think somewhat underrated game. Next up we have Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Though it's called Sonic 2, it's not the actual original true Sonic 2. A long story behind that. Also, Columns, an all-time classic, one of my personal favorite series of clones from Tetris. Also, Echo the Dolphin. And last for the Game Gear, Sonic Chaos, which is probably the best Sonic game you can play on the Sega Game Gear. Just personal preference though. Next up, what few I have on the Master System. We have the all-time classic Space Harrier, which is of course an all-time arcade classic from Sega. If you've never played, I recommend checking out Space Harrier. Also, for fans of like jet fighter games and things like that, shooters, you got Global Defense, which is a great classic from that era. Also, Chopper Lifter, which is an interesting game where, of course, obviously you use a helicopter to rescue people. That's the main goal of the game. Also, a second copy of Space Harrier. Don't ask me why I have two copies of Space Harrier. I just do, for some reason. And these are what Genesis games I have loose. First up, we have the 6-pack, sadly not in the best condition, but it includes, of course, all-time classics like Sonic the Hedgehog, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Revenge of Shinobi, Columns, and Super Hang-On, which are all true classics from early Genesis era. This is arguably one of the great first compilations really that was ever released. Also, a loose copy of Sonic the Hedgehog 2. I still found it interesting in those days when it had a not for resale thing on some of them. A lot of times it was the copies that were included with the console itself though. Also, in my opinion, a criminally underrated fighting game, and that being Eternal Champions, which is a game that definitely holds a special place for me personally. Nostalgia factor. Heavy. It was definitely a very somewhat bizarre game. And last two of the loose Genesis games, we have Phantasy Star 2, which of course is a superb, great JRPG series by Sega that I wish would get resurrected. Also, in a lot of people's opinions, the Sega equivalent to Final Fantasy VI, and that being of course Phantasy Star 4. As both these games have definitely gone up quite a bit over time. Phantasy Star 4 definitely has been going up, but so has 2. Basically, all the Phantasy Star games have been going up in price in recent time. But if you get a chance to play this game, I highly recommend trying out Phantasy Star 2 and 4. Especially 4. Next up is what couple of games I have complete in box for the Master System. First up is a cool jet fighter type, well, helicopter fighting game, as you can see from the cover art. Just a classic old school like on-rail shooter. It's actually not half bad, honestly. I actually do like the cover, personally. Next up, we have the only RPG I have, as of right now, on the Sega Master System. Which is an interesting one, to say the least. Of course, it's a classic, obviously, JRPG with turn-based. Now, the viewpoint and the way it looks at your opponent and stuff when you battle them is very similar to that of Phantasy Star. Still an interesting game in my collection. Awesome, all-time classics, of course. In my opinion, of the earlier consoles, this is probably the best version of Double Dragon, in my view. If you're wanting a little bit closer to the arcade, this was the best route to go. Still not super impressive, but keep in mind when this came out, this was actually considered pretty good for consoles at the time, in the 8-bit era. And the only other one I have complete, Afterburner, which I consider a must-have for any Master System collection. As Afterburner is all, in my opinion, probably the best classic jet fighter game of the era. Just my own personal opinion, though. But if you ever get a chance to play Afterburner, give it a shot. Definitely a solid game in my opinion. Now on to what I have complete in box of Genesis. Now first is a reproduction I got a little while back. As if you want the authentic version of this game, you're going to be shelling out well over $1,000. Yeah, this was basically considered a clone of actual Mario. Or not Mario, but The Legend of Zelda. Though, at the same time, it had, like, creatures and stuff, like, you could capture in the game, weirdly enough, which had elements of Pokemon, though. This game predates Pokemon, keep in mind. But, like you see there, it even states, like, over 40 hours. And that is true. Even in this era, like, RPGs could be quite a good size. And this is definitely a very interesting, unique game. If you are given the chance to at least try this game out, I do highly recommend giving it a shot. If you are a Zelda fan, you would appreciate this game. Next up, one of the more interesting fighting games, to say the least, a fighting game franchise that is sadly dead and long gone, unfortunately, Clay Fighter, which is a game that definitely holds a special place for me personally. And I did like the music quite a bit in this game. Definitely has it is definitely one of the most unique fighting games of this era by far. But I've always been a fan of, like, stop-motion clay animation and stuff, which is one reason I think this game appealed to me. Next up, as I've said before, my weird enjoyment of Echo, the Dolphins series of platformers. Though, personally, I think dolphins are pure evil, if you know anything actually about them. But still, nevertheless, doesn't change the fact I do love these games, for some weird reason. But yeah, The Tides of Time is very interesting game, to say the least. If you ever get a chance to try out the Echo Dolphin games, Of course, obviously, I will highly recommend checking it out. And this game actually looks, I think, very good for being a Genesis game. Also, I think this cover artwork is pretty solid as well, good quality done. Next up, one of the more recent re-additions to my collection, Vector Man, which is definitely a series of platformers 1 and 2 that I like quite a bit. I've always enjoyed Vector Man. It was probably one of the first platformers I really got into on the Genesis. Outside of Sonic, that is. Still, I think the game actually looks pretty good for its time, honestly. Next up, of course, complete in box also copy, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, as Sonic 2 is my personal favorite Sonic game of the early era of Sonic. There's some people that still prefer Sonic 1, don't get me wrong. Sonic 1 is probably my favorite soundtrack, but I still prefer Sonic the Hedgehog 2 overall, I think, gameplay-wise. And I also really liked the addition of Tails to the series. And definitely, I think some very iconic stages and everything to this game. It really added on to what was put in place by the first Sonic game and really took it a lot farther. Definitely gameplay-wise is where this game excels. Next up, it may not be a great port, but it definitely has heavy nostalgia for me, as Fatal Fury was my introduction to the SNK universe. So I owe a lot of thanks to this game specifically, as also Fatal Fury remains my favorite series by SNK of their fighters. A lot of people, it's probably King of Fighters. My secondary favorite is probably Samurai Showdown, but Fatal Fury is my favorite series of all time, and probably always will be. Just because the game is solid, and Geese is the perfect boss to despise and hate, because of how much a pain it is to fight him. Next up, I think is one of the most criminally underrated platformers, definitely on the Genesis. This game is surprisingly dark and very gothic in its setting, and I appreciate the music more than some people out there, and I actually think it is interesting when you learn a bit more about the actual story of this game. I just wish this game would make a comeback, honestly. Be resurrected, maybe remade or some for modern era. Or at least get like a decent like remaster HD treatment to the game. Come on, Sega, bring back this freaking game already. As it is one of my probably top 10 favorite Genesis games of all time. I just have a heavy nostalgia for this character specifically. I love his design and everything, and the eeriness in the music and stages, but just know this game is freaking hard. Its difficulty is definitely up there. I'm not joking. If you don't believe me, try this game out yourself. But that's something I expected from this era, honestly. Going back. Also, you hear the music in the background from Street Fighter 2. We have, or rather Super Street Fighter 2, but personally, this was the first physical Street Fighter 2 I ever actually owned on console. Was Street Fighter 2 Special Edition, aka better well known as Turbo on, of course, the Super Nintendo, as this version had everything, or rather had all of course, the 4 main bosses all unlocked in the game and everything. And plays overall pretty good. The audio is somewhat better on Turbo, but still, the game is solid for what it is, and the price is still more reasonable. Next up, sadly, it is inferior because it's a lot slower and clunkier like the original Street Fighter 2. But Super Street Fighter 2 is cool, as it would add in 4 new characters, obviously, in the game, with Cammy, T-Hawk, DJ and Fei Long. But definitely an all-time classic. And last but not least, I decided to save this for last. Of course, you have the original classic Mortal Kombat, which is an all-time classic and many people's personal favorites of the era. And admittedly, I have a certain fondness for this game. I actually like, honestly, MK1 more than MK2. I know that's probably considered heresy to a lot of people out there. And I get it. In almost every way, 2 is superior. But I just like, there's some about MK1 that appeals to me more, personally. Though MK2 is nothing to scoff at, it is definitely a great, superior sequel overall in every area. And of course, it would be the introduction of Shao Kahn and Kitaro, which is far more annoying to fight than Goro. Speaking of Kitaro right there. And many other future staples came from this game, like obviously Melina, Baraka, and others. Last but not least, of course, Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, as this is a all-time classic that I highly recommend anyone gets a chance to play. Sadly, this is not the best way to play this game. You're better off getting either the Saturn or like PS1 version, though. Then again, on PS1 you can also get Trilogy, but I think this game plays better than Trilogy overall. And yeah, the library is actually still pretty impressive when you look at the size. The fact it had Rain, Reptile, Striker, Jax, Nightwolf, Jade, Noob Saibot, Kung Lao, both Sub-Zeros, of course. Also, you had Melina, Kano, Sonya, Sector, Katana, Ermac, Scorpion, Cyrax, Shang Tsung, Liu Kang, Smoke, Sindel, and of course the Broken Cabal. Still a great game, especially if you were a fan of the ninjas. This was definitely the game to have. But with that said, that is collection video for the Sega Genesis / Master System, and of course also featuring the Game Gear. But with that said, leave me a comment below. Which of these games holds the biggest special place for you personally? But with that said, I'll see y'all next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel.